Picture yourself in a museum gift shop surrounded by Viking merchandise. Every helmet crowned with dramatic curved horns, from plastic toys to expensive replicas, all perpetuating history's most successful lie about what Vikings actually wore into battle. So sit back, grab a cup of tea, and get ready to discover the surprising truth that Vikings never wore horned helmets, explore how a 19th century opera costume became history's most persistent myth, understand why only one authentic Viking helmet has ever been found in all of Scandinavia, and learn what real Viking warriors wore into battle, the power of artistic imagination to rewrite history, and how a theatrical prop designed in 1876 fooled the world for over a century. The horned Viking helmet is everywhere. It's on football team logos in every cartoon Viking, on tourist souvenirs from Oslo to Reykjavik, in movies, video games, and children's books. It's so universal that removing the horns from a Viking image makes it seem somehow wrong, incomplete, not properly Viking. Yet this iconic symbol is about as historically accurate as depicting George Washington with a lightsaber. The real Vikings would have looked at our horned helmets with the same confusion we'd feel seeing Napoleon portrayed with fairy wings. How did this happen? How did an entire civilization's image become permanently linked to something they never wore? The answer involves a perfect storm of archaeological confusion, romantic nationalism, theatrical genius, and the unstoppable power of a compelling visual image. It's a story that tells us as much about ourselves, how we create and consume history, as it does about the Vikings. Because once an image becomes this embedded in popular culture, does the truth even matter anymore? Let's start with what we actually know about Viking helmets, which is frustratingly little. Despite the Vikings' reputation as history's most fearsome warriors, despite hundreds of Viking Age graves excavated across Scandinavia, despite their 3-century dominance of European waterways, we have exactly one, count it, one complete Viking helmet. Not one type, one actual helmet. It's called the Gjermundbu helmet, named after the farm in Norway where it was discovered in 1943, and it's the only intact Viking helmet that has survived the centuries. The Gjermundbu helmet is both spectacular and surprisingly simple. Dating to about 950 to 975 CE, right in the heart of the Viking Age, it's made of iron formed into a rounded cap, with a prominent nose guard, and what archaeologists call a spectacle guard, a face mask that protects the area around the eyes, while leaving the eyes themselves clear for vision. The construction shows sophisticated metalworking, 4 plates of iron riveted together and reinforced with bands, creating a strong but relatively light protective shell. Originally it would have had an aventail, a curtain of mail hanging from the back to protect the neck. What the Gjermundbu helmet doesn't have is horns, not a trace, no mounting points where horns might have attached, no reinforcement that could support the weight and leverage of protruding horns, no decorative elements suggesting horns were ever part of the design. It's a practical piece of military equipment designed for one purpose, keeping its wearer's skull intact during battle. Every element serves that function. Nothing is added for show. This absence becomes even more significant when you consider that the Gjermundbu helmet wasn't found in isolation. It came from a rich warrior's grave containing 2 swords, a battle axe, spearheads, shield bosses, riding equipment, and various personal items. This was clearly an important man, someone whose family could afford to bury him with top-quality military gear. If anyone would have owned a fancy horned helmet, it would have been someone like this. Yet his actual helmet is hornless, practical, designed for real combat rather than ceremonial display. But one helmet doesn't tell the whole story. What about helmet fragments from other sites? Archaeologists have found pieces of several other helmets from the Viking Age, sections of iron, occasional nose guards, fragments of mail. From Lokrum in Gotland, from Tjela in Denmark, from various Norwegian sites. Every fragment tells the same story: practical military equipment without any sign of horns. The consistency is striking. Different regions, different time periods within the Viking Age, different social contexts, but no horns anywhere. We also have contemporary depictions of Vikings created by people who actually saw them. The Bayeux tapestry, woven in the 1070s, shows Norman warriors, many of Viking descent, in battle. Their helmets, simple conical caps with nose guards, exactly like the Gjermundbu helmet. Picture stones from Gotland showing warriors in combat. No horns. Carved scenes on Swedish runestones? No horns. Even when Vikings depicted their gods in full war gear, they gave them practical helmets, not horned ceremonial pieces. The written sources align with the archaeological evidence. When saga writers describe battle gear, they mention helmets of iron, sometimes gilded for wealthy warriors, sometimes with face guards, but never with horns. The sagas love to describe distinctive weapons and armour. They'll spend verses on a particularly fine sword or an unusual shield. If warriors had worn something as visually striking as horned helmets, the saga writers would have mentioned it. Their silence speaks volumes. Consider the practicalities of combat, and the absence of horns makes even more sense. Viking warfare involved shield walls, tight formations where men stood shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping, creating a mobile fortress. In this formation, any protrusion from your helmet becomes a liability. Horns would catch on your neighbour's equipment, snag on overhead branches during forest ambushes, provide perfect handholds for enemies to grab and control your head. In the chaos of hand-to-hand combat, horns would be worse than useless. They'd be actively dangerous to the wearer. Weight distribution matters too. Horns extending from a helmet create leverage that puts strain on the neck with every movement. Turn your head quickly, something you'd need to do constantly in battle, and those horns create rotational forces that could throw you off balance. Run, and they'd bounce and shift. Fight in a ship battle with low-hanging rigging, and you're asking for disaster. The Vikings were practical warriors who lived or died by their equipment's functionality. They wouldn't handicap themselves with combat gear designed for appearance over effectiveness. The Viking emphasis on mobility would have made horned helmets even more impractical. These were warriors who perfected the art of rapid amphibious assault, sailing their shallow draft ships up rivers, leaping out for lightning raids, disappearing before organised resistance could form. They travelled light, moved fast, and struck hard. Every piece of equipment had to justify its weight and bulk. Decorative horns that served no protective function, that's extra weight and wind resistance for no combat benefit. So where did the horned helmet myth come from? To understand this, we need to travel back before the Vikings, to the Bronze Age and Iron Age cultures of Northern Europe. Here we do find horned helmets, but they're nothing like what popular culture imagines on Viking heads. The Vexo helmets from Denmark, dating to about 1000 BCE, nearly 2000 years before the Viking Age, are bronze ceremonial pieces with long, elegant horns. They were probably never meant for combat, instead serving religious or ceremonial functions. These pre-Viking horned helmets were rare, precious objects associated with religious rituals rather than warfare. We see them depicted in Bronze Age rock art, carried by figures who appear to be priests or gods rather than warriors. The horns themselves often end in decorative plates or bells, clearly ritual objects rather than practical military equipment. By the time the Viking Age began, this tradition had been dead for over a millennium, but 19th century antiquarians discovering these ancient horned helmets made a fateful error in attribution. The confusion was understandable given the state of archaeological knowledge in the 1800s. Early antiquarians often lumped together finds from vastly different time periods. A Bronze Age helmet and a Viking Age sword might be displayed together as ancient Nordic artifacts, without clear temporal distinction. The science of dating archaeological finds was in its infancy. Without modern techniques like radiocarbon dating or detailed typological analysis, scholars relied on guesswork and assumption. Adding to the confusion were genuine Viking Age artifacts that seemed to suggest horns, but weren't helmets at all. Small metal figurines from the Viking Age sometimes show warriors with protrusions from their heads. Modern analysis suggests these represent something else entirely, perhaps specific hairstyles, ritual headdresses, or even artistic convention for showing divine figures. But 19th century scholars, already primed to see horned helmets, interpreted these ambiguous images as confirmation of their assumptions. Then there's the matter of berserkers, those legendary Viking warriors who fought in a trance-like fury. Medieval sources describe berserkers wearing animal skins, bear pelts or wolf hides, as they entered their battle rage. Some scholars in the Romantic period conflated these animal skin-wearing warriors with the idea of horned helmets, imagining Vikings wearing complete animal heads, horns and all, into battle. It made for dramatic imagery, but bore no relationship to historical reality. The real transformation of the Viking image came with the 19th century's Romantic nationalism. Across Europe, nations were seeking to define their identities by reaching back to an idealized past. For Germany and the Nordic countries, the Vikings represented a powerful symbol of Northern European strength and independence, but the Vikings of history, slave traders, pragmatic merchants, adaptable settlers, didn't quite fit the Romantic narrative, so they were reimagined as noble savages, wild warriors from a purer time. Enter Karl Emil Doepler, a German costume designer tasked with creating costumes for Richard Wagner's Der Ring der Nibelungen, The Ring Cycle. Wagner's epic opera, first performed complete in 1876, required costume designs that would immediately communicate ancient Germanic warrior to 19th century audiences. Doepler faced a challenge: how to make singers visible and distinctive on stage, especially in the dim gaslight of 19th century theatres. Doepler's solution was genius from a theatrical perspective. He gave his Viking-inspired characters elaborate horned helmets that created dramatic silhouettes, caught the stage lights, and made characters instantly recognizable even from the back rows. The horns served multiple theatrical functions. They made characters appear taller and more imposing. They provided visual interest that read well at a distance, and they created an exotic, otherworldly appearance that separated the mythological characters from the contemporary audience. Wagner's operas weren't just entertainment. They were cultural events that shaped how Germans and other Europeans understood their heritage. The Ring Cycle was performed repeatedly across Europe and America. The striking visual of horned Viking warriors became inextricably linked with ideas of Nordic heritage and Germanic mythology. What started as a practical solution to a staging problem became accepted as historical fact. The power of Wagner's imagery was amplified by the broader cultural movement of the time. The late 19th century saw a Viking revival across popular culture. Children's books illustrated with Doepler-inspired horned Vikings became standard nursery fare. Popular magazines ran stories of Viking adventures, invariably illustrated with horned helmets. Academic paintings depicting scenes from Nordic mythology adopted the theatrical convention. Each repetition reinforced the image until it became impossible to imagine Vikings any other way. Early photography and film cemented the transformation. When filmmakers in the 1910s and 1920s needed to depict Vikings, they turned to the established visual vocabulary, which meant horned helmets. These early films, often based on Wagner's operas or similar romantic interpretations, spread the image globally. The horned Viking helmet transcended its Germanic romantic origins to become a universal symbol, recognized from Tokyo to Tennessee. The American adoption of the horned Viking image added new layers of meaning. For American audiences, Vikings represented a particular type of masculine ideal, wild, free, untamed by civilization's restrictions. The horned helmet became visual shorthand for primal warrior energy. When the Minnesota Vikings football team chose their logo in 1961, the horned helmet was inevitable. It didn't matter that Minnesotans of Scandinavian descent knew better. The image was too powerful to resist. Comic strips and cartoons found the horned helmet irresistible. Hagar the Horrible, Prince Valiant, and countless other Viking characters sported horns. In the simplified visual language of comics, the horned helmet instantly identified a character as Viking without need for explanation. Children grew up with these images, internalizing the association so deeply that the historical helmet seems wrong by comparison. The myth had become more real than reality. Modern popular culture hasn't helped matters. Video games need visually distinctive character designs, and horned helmets provide instant recognition. Movies face the same challenge that Doepler did, making characters distinctive and memorable for audiences. Even productions that pride themselves on historical accuracy often include at least some horned helmets, usually with a winking acknowledgement of the myth. "We know it's wrong," they seem to say, "but audiences expect it." The tourism industry has a vested interest in maintaining the myth. Viking-themed attractions from Norway to North America feature horned helmets prominently, Gift shops stock horned helmet replicas by the thousands. Tourist photos in horned helmets generate millions of social media posts annually. The economic incentive to perpetuate the myth far outweighs any interest in historical accuracy. A historically accurate Geirmundbu helmet replica simply doesn't sell as well as a dramatic horned version. Museums face a constant battle. The Geirmundbu helmet, displayed in Oslo's Museum of Cultural History, often disappoints visitors expecting horns. Museum educators report that debunking the horned helmet myth is one of their most common tasks, and one of the most difficult. Visitors sometimes assume the real horned helmets must be in another room, or that this plain helmet must be some kind of lower-class version. The truth seems less interesting than the myth. The persistence of the horned helmet myth reveals fundamental truths about how popular history works. Simple, visually striking images always triumph over complex, mundane realities. Once an image achieves critical mass in popular culture, no amount of scholarly debunking can dislodge it. The myth serves emotional and commercial needs that mere facts cannot address. People want their Vikings to have horned helmets because the image is cooler, more distinctive, more Viking than the historical reality. But what did Viking warriors actually wear on their heads? The unglamorous truth is that most Vikings probably fought bareheaded or with simple caps. Metal helmets were expensive, requiring skilled smiths and quality iron. The average Viking raider, a farmer or fisherman taking a summer off for profitable violence, likely couldn't afford a metal helmet. They relied on speed, ferocity, and shield work for protection rather than armour. Those who could afford head protection had several options. Leather caps, perhaps reinforced with metal plates, provided basic protection against glancing blows. These haven't survived in the archaeological record, but contemporary descriptions and practical considerations suggest they were common. A thick leather cap might not stop a direct axe blow, but it could turn a blade that would otherwise split your skull. Spangenhelm-style helmets, conical caps made from several metal plates riveted to a framework, appear to have been the most common metal helmet type. The Geirmundbu helmet represents a more advanced version of this basic design. These helmets balanced protection, weight, and cost effectively. They could be manufactured by competent local smiths rather than requiring specialized armories. Damaged sections could be repaired or replaced without scrapping the entire helmet. Wealthy warriors might have worn mail coifs, hoods of interlocking iron rings that protected the head and neck. These required enormous labor to produce, thousands of individually riveted rings, but provided superior protection and flexibility. A mail coif could be worn alone or under a helmet for double protection. Some helmet fragments show attachment points for aventails, suggesting combined helmet and mail protection was desirable when affordable. The saga evidence suggests that distinctive helmets existed, but were rare enough to merit special mention. Gilded helmets marked kings and jarls. Helmets with decorated face guards might bear intimidating visages, but these distinctions involved surface decoration or functional additions like face guards, not structural additions like horns. The fundamental helmet shape remained practical, designed for combat effectiveness rather than visual impact. Regional variations probably existed that archaeology hasn't yet revealed. The Vikings weren't a monolithic culture, but a collection of related peoples with local traditions. Norwegian Vikings might have favoured slightly different helmet styles than Danish or Swedish ones. Rus Vikings operating in Eastern Europe might have adopted Byzantine or Slavic influences, but none of these variations involved horns that we can be certain of from the complete absence of evidence. What's particularly telling is how Vikings depicted themselves and their gods. When they carved pictures of warriors on stones or decorated weapons with martial scenes, they showed practical armour. Thor and Odin, when shown ready for battle, wear the same kinds of helmets as mortal warriors. If horned helmets had possessed any special religious or cultural significance, we'd expect to see them in these self-representations. Instead, Viking art shows a culture that valued functional military equipment. The climate and environment of Viking military operations made practical headgear even more important. Shipboard combat in the North Atlantic meant dealing with spray, rain, and wind. A horned helmet would catch every gust, potentially throwing its wearer off balance at crucial moments. Forest ambushes, a favourite Viking tactic, would be impossible with horns snagging on every low branch. Even simple march discipline would be complicated by protruding horns knocking against equipment and comrades. The Viking military system depended on mobility and flexibility. Raiders needed to be able to row for hours, then fight, then row again. They might need to portage their ships over land, carrying equipment for miles. They slept rough, often in their war gear. Every piece of equipment needed to serve multiple functions and withstand hard use. Ceremonial additions that complicated these basic requirements wouldn't have survived the natural selection of Viking warfare. Let's talk about specific battles and what contemporary sources tell us about Viking equipment. At the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describes the Norwegian Vikings' appearance but mentions no horned helmets. And this was a battle where the Norse king Harald Hardrada was trying to claim the English throne, a situation where you'd expect maximum display of martial splendour. The English sources, which had no reason to downplay Viking exoticism, describe mail shirts and standard helmets. The Battle of Clontarf in 1014, where Irish forces defeated a Viking army outside Dublin, generated multiple accounts from Irish sources. These sources love to emphasise the fearsome appearance of the Viking warriors, their superior armour and weapons, yet no horned helmets appear in these descriptions. Irish sources describe gleaming mail, decorated shields, intimidating battle standards, all the visual elements that made Vikings fearsome, but no horns. Even in defeat, when chroniclers might be expected to emphasise the exotic or demonic appearance of their enemies, horned helmets don't appear. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle's account of Viking raids emphasises their sudden appearance, their cruelty, their paganism, but never mentions unusual helmets. French chronicles describing Viking attacks on Paris go into detail about their tactics and equipment, but record nothing about horned helmets. The absence becomes even more striking when you consider how chroniclers did describe unusual enemy equipment when they encountered it. Byzantine sources carefully noted the distinctive equipment of various enemies, the lamellar armour of steppe nomads, the unique weapons of different cultures. They described Varangian Guard members, Vikings in Byzantine service, in detail, but recorded standard military equipment, not exotic horned helmets. Archaeological evidence from Viking military camps reinforces this picture. Excavations at sites like the Viking winter camps in England have found military equipment, weapons, armour fragments, horse gear. No horned helmet pieces. The Trelleborg fortresses in Denmark, clearly military installations, have yielded various artefacts, but no evidence of horned helmets. If such distinctive items existed, we'd expect to find at least fragments. The economics of Viking warfare also argue against horned helmets. Viking armies needed to equip hundreds or thousands of warriors for campaigns. Equipment needed to be relatively standardized, maintainable in the field, and replaceable from battlefield salvage. Specialized ceremonial items like horned helmets would complicate logistics without providing combat advantage. Viking success depended partly on their ability to operate far from home with minimal supply lines. Exotic equipment would undermine this advantage. So if Vikings didn't wear horned helmets, did anybody in medieval Europe? The answer is yes, but not for war. Ceremonial helmets with various projections, not always horns, appear in medieval art associated with tournaments, pageants, and heraldic display. These were essentially costume pieces, worn for parades or ceremonial combat, where appearance mattered more than protection. Some medieval helmets sported elaborate crests, dragons, lions, eagles, that would be suicidal in actual combat. The key distinction is between battlefield equipment and ceremonial gear. Medieval knights understood this difference perfectly. They might wear an elaborate crested helmet for a tournament or state occasion, then switch to a practical bassinet for actual warfare. Vikings, lacking the elaborate tournament culture of later medieval Europe, seem to have maintained this practical focus even more strictly. Their ceremonial display involved decorated weapons and jewellery, not impractical armour modifications. The horned helmet myth also obscures the real sophistication of Viking military equipment. The Geirmundbu helmet represents advanced metallurgy and design. Its construction required significant skill, forging iron plates to consistent thickness, shaping them to create an effective shell, riveting them together with overlapping joints for strength. The spectacle guard shows understanding of facial protection needs while maintaining visibility. This wasn't primitive equipment, but carefully engineered military technology. Viking smiths were capable of sophisticated metalwork when it served practical purposes. Pattern-welded Damascus steel swords, articulated mail shirts, complex locks and mechanisms all demonstrate high technical skill. If they'd wanted to create horned helmets, they certainly had the ability. That they didn't suggest a cultural preference for functional over decorative military equipment, at least in the helmet department. The spread of the horned helmet myth accelerated with mass media. Every decade brought new reinforcement: movies in the 1950s, television in the 1960s, video games in the 1980s, internet memes in the 2000s. Each new medium found the horned helmet irresistible for the same reasons Dupla did: instant recognition, visual drama, and differentiation from other warrior types. The myth had achieved escape velocity, independent of any historical foundation. Educational efforts to correct the myth face an uphill battle. Teachers report that students often resist the correction, feeling somehow cheated by the less dramatic reality. The horned helmet has become so integrated into the concept of Viking that removing it feels like diminishing Vikings themselves. This emotional attachment to the myth reveals how deeply visual symbols embed themselves in cultural consciousness. Professional historians have largely given up fighting the popular image directly. Instead, they focus on explaining why the myth exists and what it tells us about how history is constructed and consumed. The horned helmet becomes a teaching tool for understanding historical methodology, source criticism, and the relationship between popular and academic history. It's a perfect example of how what everyone knows can be completely wrong. The myth has even generated its own scholarly literature. Academic papers analyze the cultural meaning of the horned helmet, its role in national identity formation, its function in popular culture. The myth has become historically significant in its own right, regardless of its factual inaccuracy. Future historians studying the 20th and 21st centuries will need to understand the horned helmet myth to comprehend how modern people understood Vikings. Modern Viking reenactors face the horned helmet problem constantly. Those committed to historical accuracy wear realistic helmets or go bareheaded. But at public events, spectators often express disappointment. "Where are your horns?" becomes a constant refrain. Some reenactors carry educational materials specifically addressing the helmet myth. Others have given up, wearing historically accurate gear, while resignedly fielding questions about missing horns. The heritage industry in Scandinavia maintains an uneasy relationship with the myth. Serious museums stick to historical accuracy, displaying the Gjermundbu helmet and explaining the myth's origins, but tourist-oriented sites often hedge their bets, selling horned helmet souvenirs while providing accurate information for those who want it. The economic reality is that horned helmets sell better than historically accurate merchandise. Even academic Viking studies can't entirely escape the horned helmet's shadow. Serious scholarly books about Vikings often feel obligated to address the myth in their introductions, if only to set it aside. The helmet has become a mandatory talking point, a piece of negative space that must be acknowledged. It's as if every book about Vikings must begin by explaining what Vikings weren't, before moving on to what they were. The persistence of the myth raises uncomfortable questions about public history and education. If we can't successfully correct something as simple and demonstrable as the horned helmet myth, what hope do we have of addressing more complex historical misconceptions? The helmet becomes a canary in the coal mine for historical literacy, suggesting that popular understanding of history operates by different rules than academic history. Social media has given the myth new life, while also providing platforms for correction. Memes featuring horned Viking helmets proliferate endlessly, each repetition reinforcing the false image. But historians and educators also use social media to spread accurate information. The result is a constant battle between myth and reality, playing out in real time across thousands of posts and comments. The myth usually wins through sheer volume. The commercial power of the horned helmet ensures its survival. Sports teams won't abandon their horned logos. Tourism boards won't stop using the instantly recognizable symbol. Entertainment media won't sacrifice visual clarity for historical accuracy. The horned helmet has achieved immortality through commerce, embedded in too many economic interests to ever disappear. It's no longer just a historical mistake, but a valuable intellectual property. Modern pagans and Norse heritage enthusiasts face particular frustration with the horned helmet. Those seriously interested in understanding and connecting with Viking Age culture must constantly distinguish themselves from the popular cartoon image. The horned helmet becomes a barrier to serious engagement with Norse history and spirituality. Yet even within these communities, debates arise about whether to fight the image or resignedly accept it. The horned helmet myth teaches us that historical truth and cultural truth aren't the same thing. In the realm of verifiable fact, Vikings didn't wear horned helmets, but in the realm of cultural imagination, they absolutely did and always will. The image has achieved a reality independent of historical fact. This parallel existence of myth and reality characterizes much of popular history, but rarely so clearly as with the horned Viking helmet. What would Vikings themselves think of their horned helmet image? They were, after all, master manipulators of reputation who understood the power of fear and spectacle. Viking raiders cultivated fearsome reputations through genuine brutality, but also through psychological warfare. Would they appreciate the intimidating image created by the horned helmet, even if they never wore such things? Or would they be appalled by the impracticality of it all? The answer probably depends on context. Vikings were pragmatists who adapted quickly to new situations. They adopted foreign customs when useful, abandoned traditions when necessary, and showed remarkable cultural flexibility. Faced with a modern horned helmet myth, they might well have found a way to exploit it. Perhaps modern tourism boards selling horned helmet souvenirs are more truly Viking in spirit than historical reenactors insisting on accuracy. As we near the end of our journey through the strange history of the horned helmet, it's worth considering what this myth means for our understanding of Vikings more generally. If we've been wrong about something as basic and visual as what they wore on their heads, what else have we gotten wrong? How many other Viking facts are actually 19th century inventions or medieval misunderstandings? The honest answer is quite a lot. The popular image of Vikings as savage raiders ignores their roles as traders, settlers and state builders. The idea of Vikings as uniquely violent warriors overlooks the general brutality of medieval warfare. The notion of Vikings as primitive pagans misses their quick adoption of Christianity and other foreign ideas. The horned helmet is just the most visible symbol of a broader mythologization that obscures historical Vikings behind modern fantasy. Yet perhaps there's value in the myth too. The horned helmet, however historically inaccurate, has kept Vikings alive in popular consciousness. It's created economic opportunities for Scandinavian countries through tourism. It's provided a visual symbol that, while wrong in detail, captures something of the Viking impact on historical imagination. The myth serves purposes that mere accuracy couldn't achieve. The real lesson of the horned helmet might be humility about historical knowledge. Despite our advanced archaeological techniques, despite massive scholarly effort, despite easy access to accurate information, a theatrical costume design from 1876 still dominates popular understanding. This should make us cautious about assuming we've gotten other aspects of history right. What myths are we creating or perpetuating today that future generations will have to correct? In the end, we're left with two Vikings, the historical one who wore practical military equipment or no helmet at all, and the mythological one whose horned helmet has achieved immortality through popular culture. Both versions tell us important things, one about medieval Scandinavian warfare and society, the other about modern needs for symbols and simplification. Neither is going away anytime soon. The Geirmundbu helmet sits in its museum case, unadorned and practical, the only complete survivor from centuries of Viking warfare. It tells its quiet truth to those who care to listen. Vikings were practical warriors who valued function over form in their military equipment. But outside the museum, on streets filled with tourist shops and sports bars, the horned helmet reigns supreme, a lie too powerful to die, a myth too useful to abandon. Perhaps that's fitting. The Vikings were, after all, storytellers as much as warriors. They understood the power of narrative to shape reality. The sagas they told about themselves mixed fact with fiction, history with mythology. In a strange way, the Horned Helmet myth continues this tradition. We're still telling stories about Vikings, still mixing fact with fiction, still creating mythology from history. The helmets may be wrong, but the impulse is authentically human. So the next time you see a Viking image complete with horned helmet, and you will probably before the day is out, remember that you're looking at a 19th century theatrical costume, not medieval military equipment. But remember too that you're seeing the power of visual culture to create its own reality, the triumph of compelling imagery over mundane fact. The horned helmet may be a lie, but it's a lie that tells us important truths about how history works in the popular imagination. The Vikings conquered much of Europe through superior mobility, tactical innovation, and sheer audacity. But their greatest conquest came centuries after their age ended. The conquest of global popular culture through the power of a costume designer's imagination. They achieved immortality not through their real helmets of iron, but through fictional horns that never existed. In the grand saga of human culture, perhaps that's the most Viking victory of all, winning through unexpected means, adapting to new circumstances, and leaving a mark that outlasts mere historical fact.